In today's Locked On Pelicans, I'll tell you the big lesson the Pelicans need to learn after the Denver Nuggets shockingly fired their head coach Michael Malone and GM Calvin Booth. It's the Wednesday episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with y'all on this Wednesday, day after the Pelicans lose to the Brooklyn Nets. Hooray! A little bit closer than we wanted at the end of that one. We'll talk about Antonio Reeves, Karlo, Matkovic in the third segment of today's show. But I want to get into a big takeaway, in my opinion, from the Denver Nuggets shockingly firing their head coach Michael Malone and their general manager Calvin Booth. And while maybe it's somewhat expected that eventually that would happen, to do it in the way that they did, 3 games left in the regular season, tells you something. And there's also a takeaway with this from the Memphis Grizzlies firing Taylor Jenkins so late in the season as well. So this is something the Pelicans need to learn as they're potentially going to go through a head coaching search. So that's going to be the focus of today's show. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well and become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to the Locked On Pelicans podcast. All right. Let's start to get into this one here a little bit because there's a lot to unpack. So you're going to need to bear with me just for a minute here because we need to kind of go over a few things to kind of lead us to the main point and the lesson that the Pelicans need to take away from this, which frankly, too long didn't listen to the show, is you need to have both your general manager and head coach on the same page. And I'm not saying that David Griffin and Willie Green aren't on the same page. In fact, I think they very much are. But if you are going to move on from Willie Green, then that has implications on David Griffin as well. So we're going to get into all of that here. The main takeaway is not I would hire Michael Malone in a second. And I would hire Michael Malone in a second. Same with Taylor Jenkins. You know, they were both fired because of different but messy reasons. So you need your GM and coach on the same page. Again, none of that has come out of New Orleans that they are not. But they definitely weren't in Denver and they weren't in Memphis. And both of these are similar but different because both the GM and head coach got fired in Denver. Michael Malone and Calvin Booth both out less than 2 years after winning an NBA title. You know, Memphis, having been a playoff team, second seed in back-to-back years, fired their head coach because he and the general manager basically were not seeing eye to eye. And the GM has the power to do that, made that decision, and boom, a good head coach is out of a job. Not the smart look. You can justify both firings. Maybe not this late in the season, but you can justify both firings. It doesn't mean that the Pelicans then immediately need to fire Willie Green. I saw a lot of people being like, well, if Michael Malone is fired, the Pelicans need to fire Willie Green. Not this second. They might need to fire him after this offseason. I don't necessarily think they need to either. I think they could. I think it's going to depend. We'll talk more about that in the next segment here. So when you look at the situation in Denver, those two like really kind of openly despised each other, Calvin Booth and Michael Malone. But you're in this situation where you're winning games, you've been good, you won a title, you're going to try and just make it work for the most part, is really what this comes down to. Until you struggle. And Denver is looking like they could be a play-in tournament team. And when you look at the year that Nikola Jokic, the, in my opinion, undisputed best player on the planet, is having, to be a play-in team like that after you won the title is not great. Not great. And Calvin Booth, the GM, has not made the correct moves that put him at odds with Michael Malone. But you've also seen that, you know, despite the roster having issues, they were not listening to Michael Malone. Defensively, the team was really struggling and getting worse every single month. When you see a continual downslope, not just one odd month where they were bad, then they bounced back up. This was similar to the Memphis Grizzlies too, that basically since January, they have been getting statistically worse, even if you win some games. But that goes to process over results, right? Yeah, you might be getting good results, but if your process is broken, that's going to eventually lead to a decline there. You saw that with both teams here. And so if that's going to be the case, you had Calvin Booth wanting to fire Michael Malone and likely would have done so at the end of the season after a disappointing playoff run. And then their owner, and the ironic thing about this is their owner steps in and is like, you know what? We're not good enough. We need to make a decision here. Let's fire both of them because some bigger changes are needed. And we're just going to try and salvage what we can. I think he literally was like, whatever more juice you can get from this season, we're going to try and get by shaking things up. And firing a head coach is the easiest thing you can do to that. So as that team's going into the playoffs with a very big lack of momentum, maybe just getting that head coaching, that interim head coach bump is smart. And they're also promoting Adam, and it gives them a chance to evaluate him for a couple of weeks. If New Orleans was really serious about James Borrego as the future head coach of this team, I think you would have probably fired Willie Green and elevated him, knowing that you would just make that hire and boom, you're done and you can call it a day. That kind of says something to me, or that the team's potentially just being cheap or doesn't have a decision made just yet. That could also be it, or they're not going to fire head coach Willie Green. I think it says something that you wouldn't even elevate Borrego, but the season was already lost. What would there be to learn from watching him coach guys like Antonio Reeves, Karlo, Matkovic? That's not the group that you're going to have next year. And while those guys might play well, cool, whatever, right? And we'll talk about them because they did play well, both those guys. And we'll talk about them in the third segment here. So what this is all to say is, I do think you need your coach and GM on the same page. I do think it was probably a mistake for Memphis to fire Taylor Jenkins, but if the GM just doesn't believe in the coach anymore, has kind of issues there, even if the GM could have made those mistakes. And the irony with Denver was that their ownership got cheap and let them lose Bruce Brown and KCP. Like, those are key championship guys. They just let them walk because they wanted to be cheap after winning the title. I mean, this is what was going to eventually happen here. So you see everyone just kind of get off on the same page or creating like almost a toxic environment, which is not what you want. And that's going to leak down to the players. That's probably part of the reason why they were tuning out Mike Malone a good bit. So when that happens, it's not going to work. And so all of that is to say, if you need your head coach and GM kind of on the same page, in alignment, whatever words you want, lockstep would be the word David Griffin would use. And I do think that Willie Green and David Griffin are. But if that's the case, the decision on Willie Green is probably more closely linked to David Griffin. And I said this on TV this week over on Fox 8. I'm going to let you know what I think coming up here next when it comes to that in the next segment here in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by BetterHelp. Taking care of your mental health is just as important as taking care of your physical health. But traditional in-person therapy can be expensive, often ranging from $100 to $250 per session. So that's where BetterHelp comes in. With online therapy, you get quality care at a price that makes sense, saving you time and money. And I love that it's online and super convenient that way. I don't have time to go to an office, to sit down, to wait, to go in and drive back home. There's too many things going on. But when I want the help that I need, and I've used BetterHelp before, I can just hop on my phone, my tablet for my session, feel better and work through the things that I need to. Because therapy isn't just for life's toughest moments. It can help with everyday stress, learning how to set boundaries, develop positive coping skills, communicating with your partner. Having access to support when you need it can make a really big difference. So your well-being is worth it. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA to get started. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast and join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And don't forget about the Locked On Pelicans daily newsletter. Playoffs are out of reach, but this offseason is going to be a lot of fun with the draft, with free agency for the Pelicans. So stay up to date on all the offseason news, draft coverage, and expert analysis by subscribing to the Locked On Pelicans newsletter. And if you subscribe between now and April 30th of 2025, you're going to have a chance to win one of amazing prizes. A $2,500 Best Buy gift card to upgrade your viewing experience, a $300 Game Time gift card to buy tickets, a $200 Fanatics gift card if you want to buy a jersey. So get exclusive insight into free agency, draft coverage, team updates delivered straight to your inbox. Join Locked On Pelicans for trusted coverage every day. Subscribe to enter by clicking the link in the description or go to lockedondaily.com. All right, let's get into the big point. It took a lot to set all of that up, in my opinion. Just kind of go over those circumstances here, right? Like, it's not as simple as saying, well, Michael Malone was fired, So they need to fire Willie Green, or Taylor Jenkins was fired, so they need to fire Willie Green. Look, they're justified, and it's very valid if you want Willie Green fired. It's also very valid if you want him to stay. Like, there isn't a right or wrong answer on this. He's shown flashes of being a good coach, and I don't think this season was really his problem. But I'm not the biggest Willie Green fan, admittedly, here. So here's the thing. If you need them in lockstep with all of this, right? Let's call it that. If you let David Griffin fire Willie Green and select the next head coach, maybe Michael Malone's agents are reaching out and be like, I want to coach in New Orleans. I want to go there. I want to coach Cooper Flagg. I want to coach Zion Williamson. I want to coach Trey Murphy. I want to coach Herb Jones. All those guys. I want to do that. And, how could you say no to something like that? There's a way, and I'll tell you in a minute here. And you let David Griffin select him as the next head coach. You need to give Griff a long extension, right? Because if you then fire David Griffin after he's hired the next head coach for this team, and then in a year, the team doesn't do well, let's say, and you're like, you know what, we need to change management. You're going to bring in a new general manager who has not hired your head coach of the team, who's now on a 3 or 4 year deal with 2 or 3 years left. That sounds like a miserable situation that's going to set up, a situation where Monty Williams was hired before Dell Demps, and those two just did not see eye to eye, and Dell Demps couldn't wait to fire him, and it just took a couple of years. That is not conducive to winning or a good situation for this team in any capacity whatsoever. So if you are going to fire Willie Green, in my opinion, you need to fire David Griffin as well. And so thus, it should just really be, you make a determination on Willie Green, you hire somebody, or not Willie Green, David Griffin, you hire your next president of basketball operations, GM, whatever the titles are going to be, lead basketball decision maker, and you let them decide on Willie Green. And that answer should just be, fire him or hold on to him for one more year and then go and get your coach. But if it means you could get a Michael Malone, a Taylor Jenkins, maybe that's the best thing to do right now. Look, one of the things I have long said, if you're an everydayer, you know this. I think there's 5 head coaches that help you win games in the league, maybe 7, and 5 to 7 guys that actively hurt you. Willie Green is not in either category. He's just right in the middle. Right in the middle. Not one of the worst ones, but here's the thing with that, right? Just saying he's not one of the worst coaches in the league is not a justification necessarily for keeping him as the head coach. If you don't have one of those 5 to 7 coaches that are helping you win games, then you need to believe that your guy can turn into one of them, or you need to go and find that next one and go and hire that person. Malone and Taylor Jenkins can both Malone is, but Jenkins could be in that top 5 to 7 coaches as well. So I would hire either of them in a second. I will say this as an asterisk. I try not to get too much into the ownership stuff because, frankly, it's not because some people who don't know what they're talking about want to try and be like, well, they're being nice because they'll revoke his credential. People get their credentials revoked because they do very inappropriate things. That's what it takes. Not because they speak negatively about the team. I say negative things all the time. I was saying fire Willie Green after 2 games this year. Team didn't really have a problem with that, even if they disagreed with it here. When it comes to ownership, is Gail Benson's not selling the team. She's just not selling the team. It's not going to happen. Anything I can say here doesn't matter. And frankly, she's investing in the organization in a way that you might just not see, and it's unfortunately not reflecting out there on the court. But by building new facilities and things like that, that goes a long way with a small market team. But she's not selling the team. So we just have to live with that as a reality. I would like her to spend more, to be different, certainly, but I don't think she's one of the cheapest owners in the league. It's just one of those facts that you have to accept. And if you can't accept that, it's okay, but nothing's going to change from this. So you got to kind of live with it, right? Control the things you can kind of control, or the things that could be controlled. Ownership's not really one of them. I would imagine that Michael Malone and Taylor Jenkins are going to be the 2 hot coaching commodities on the market. I would imagine that if Greg Popovich retires, and look, I hope he doesn't, but if he wants to, that Michael Malone is a shoo-in for the San Antonio Spurs job, that they would hire him immediately. Maybe the same for Taylor Jenkins, but those guys, maybe one would go to the Phoenix Suns because it looks like they're going to fire their head coach. There's going to be a bunch of vacancies open. They can kind of have their pick of the jobs, potentially in Sacramento as well. That's to say that those guys are going to be very expensive. I don't know what Michael Malone's salary was. I don't know what Taylor Jenkins' salary was. But look, I think it's probably safe to say Willie Green's one of the lowest paid head coaches in the league. You could even look at someone like Mike Brown, who's a very good coach, fired earlier in the season from the Sacramento Kings. He was making $10 million a year. I don't think they're going to come close to paying a head coach $10 million a year here in New Orleans. And that might mean you don't get Malone, you don't get Taylor Jenkins. That's kind of the going rate for one of the top coaches in the league at this point, is right around that like $8 to $10, $11 million mark, somewhere in there. Something to keep in mind that, if you're not going to get one of those big names or a guy that you think is going to be a difference maker, you can kind of go with a young up and coming coach. Sure, pluck an assistant. We'll do shows on that. Don't worry. And try and kind of improve that way. But if you want one of these guys, like, it is going to take kind of a commitment from ownership to do it. Will they do that kind of thing? I think is a little bit of an open question right now, but we also don't know what they're going to do with Willie Green. And so, as I was saying before, it probably needs to be linked to David Griffin. If you hire Michael Malone as a $10 million head coach under David Griffin, then you fire David Griffin in a year, and then a new lead basketball decision maker comes in and gets at odds with Michael Malone, like, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? You're not going to fire your $10 million head coach, right? Like, that payout's enormous for them not to work for you anymore. Very few teams want to do that type of thing. So that presents a big problem that could just breed toxicity around the franchise. That can leak down to the players, as we've saw a little bit here in Denver this year. There have been some rumblings of some discontent, though I think it was a little overblown when it came to the Memphis Grizzlies. You need both of these parts, the coach and the front office, on the same page. Let me ask you this question. If you don't like David Griffin, but you could get Michael Malone, but it meant keeping David Griffin like 4 more years, along with, say, Michael Malone for 4 years, would you do that? I'm actually kind of curious by that question now, because I think they need to be linked together, because we've seen it happen here before with Dell Demps and Monty Williams, where it wasn't, and that wasn't great. And you're seeing what it's kind of happening here in Denver and Memphis, when both those groups kind of start from being like great, good friends, all that, to, yeah, no, this ain't working, and that's a problem. Because look, to fire Michael Malone, who won a championship, the team's only championship, 2 years ago, who's the winningest coach in franchise history, who had been there for 10 years, by all accounts is a very good head coach, who, by the way, coached a year under Monty Williams in Monty's first year. That is massively concerning to me, right? Like, that's just toxic and messed up and not great. And they could have fired Calvin Booth, but kept Michael Malone, and they decided not to do all that. Like, that's a mess of a situation. I don't want to see the Pelicans be in a mess of a situation. I can probably live with a mess of a situation after winning a title 2 years ago, but still not like the ideal thing for anyone to want to be, situation for anyone to want to be in, and all of that. So they need everyone kind of on the same page. So that means the decision on Willie Green should really come down to, are you keeping David Griffin or not? If you're firing him, you fire Willie Green too, and you bring in someone new and you let them build the structure. David Griffin was hired and kind of forced to keep on Alvin Gentry. That didn't work out. He was fired after a year. Now that he made a mistake with Stan Van Gundy, but at least to his credit, undid that mistake by firing him after 1 year. This would be the 4th coach that has been under David Griffin. This would be his 3rd hire of the 4 coaches. It's not an ideal scenario here. This is something that the team needs to kind of figure out. This goes to something I've been saying recently of pick a direction. Pick a direction. We're going to go for it full send, which might mean hiring Michael Malone, keeping David Griffin, trading the pick, and trying to be a contender next year. Or let's go through a rebuild and we can kind of figure it out from there. But you need to make sure you know what you're doing with David Griffin too. I think there's reasons to keep him. I think there's reasons to move on too. I think overall his tenure's been pretty good here, and just injuries have derailed this team repeatedly. But that also might mean you need to make a decision on the Zion era as well, because that hasn't gone as we want. So all of these things are tied together, and I find it kind of an interesting conversation. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Pelicans also played a game on Tuesday night. Let's look at the loss to the Brooklyn Nets. Whoa, they made us nervous there at the end of that one, did they? That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by with Robinhood. With Robinhood Gold, you can now enjoy the VIP treatment, receiving a 3% IRA match on retirement contributions. The privileges of the very privileged are no longer exclusive. With Robinhood Gold, your annual IRA contributions are boosted by 3%, plus you also get 4% APY on your cash in non-retirement accounts. That's over 8 times the national savings average. The perks of the high net worth are now available for any net worth. So the new gold standard is here with Robinhood Gold. To receive your 3% boost on annual IRA contributions, sign up at robinhood.com/gold. Investing involves risk, rate subject to change. 3% match requires Robinhood Gold at $5 a month for 1 year from first match. Must keep funds in IRA for 5 years. Go to robinhood.com/boost. Over 8 times the national savings average account interest rate claim is based on data from the FDIC as of November 18th, 2024. Robinhood Gold Financial LLC, member SIPC. Gold membership is offered by Robinhood Gold LLC. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast and join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to the Locked On Pelicans podcast. Don't forget about Locked On Saints with the new Saints Squad show twice a week. Some of my favorite people in Saints media, Lance Moore included on there, breaking down the Saints in a group setting from Ross Jackson and the Locked On Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Make them your second listen today. And don't forget about that newsletter giveaway. Go sign up over at lockedondaily.com. All right, Pelicans played. Let's talk about it. Great loss, in my opinion, by the way. 119-114 loss to the Brooklyn Nets. This is what you want. This goes to what we talked about the other day on the show of you want to compete. You want them to compete. You want to see some of these guys play well. They did that in this game, and they fell just short as the Nets kind of dominated the second half of this one. Final score wasn't quite as close as it was because that third quarter is where New Orleans lost this one, losing 43-26. Big time comeback in the fourth, winning that quarter 35-22, but it wasn't enough, and that's good because game of the year for the Pelicans is tonight, Wednesday, when you're listening to this, and that is the Philadelphia 76ers playing against the, I'm completely blanking, Philadelphia 76ers taking on, the Washington Wizards here, and that's a big one because Philly has New Orleans is up on them 2 in the loss column. There's 3 games left to go. If Philly wins this game, then New Orleans can only, at worst, tie with Philadelphia for the 4th best odds in the lottery. And at that point, basically, New Orleans has even some wiggle room where if they were to win a game, it could probably be okay going forward. Not that I'm expecting them to, but there's at least a chance that if you do that, you could end up okay from all of that. So tonight's game, depending on when you're listening to this, I'm recording, it's like 10 o'clock on Tuesday, is actually like very important for the Pelicans, and it's just really as simple as that, even though they're not playing here. So this was an important loss to kind of start to put those solidifying the 4th spot in the lottery position like in play for New Orleans here. But they got some good performances. So while we're happy about the loss, man, it's so weird to feel that way. Good performances from some of the young guys, which is exactly what you want to see. And let's start with Antonio Reeves in this game. 17 points from him, 3 rebounds, 2 assists, 2 steals, just 1 turnover. More importantly, 4 of 10 from 3. If he's going to take 10 shot attempts from deep, if he's going to make 4 of them, this is the type of player New Orleans needs. He's been very consistent recently, and you can see he's at least on the scouting report for some of these teams right now, which is kind of fun to see, which then means they're not going to only leave him open for 3. They're going to close out on him hard, and it's going to force him to have to do other things. This is where watching him play, and these reps are actually pretty valuable. Because if you were playing with your full group of guys and he's just getting some run out there, he's probably going to be left open basically every single time, and it's not going to be a growth opportunity. It's just you make your shots or you don't make your shots. As simple as that. Here, though, when they close out hard on him, all right, let's put the ball on the wood and drive and attack, and then what do? And forcing him into those situations, which happened a bunch against Brooklyn in this one, watching him try and attack the basket and do all those things, even if he wasn't making those shots or missing some of them, was pretty great. At one point, he did attack baseline and had this nice little up and under move on a reverse layup, got fouled, it went in, he went to the line where he made the and one play. You want to see that type of decision-making from him. going forward and showing that he's just more than a shooter, right? That's one of the things we've been talking about when it comes to the draft. More than a shooter. Show that off. Show that you can attack. Show that you can attack, punish bad closeouts and things like that. He definitely did in this game. And of course, the shooting's good too. You really want to see that. Karlo Matkovic off the bench in 26 minutes of action looked great in this one. 17 points, 4 rebounds, an assist, a steal, 2 blocks. He shows off some rim protection, y'all. Making 1 of 2 from the line, 0 for 2 from 3, but 8 for 11. Look, you look at his shot profile, it's either inside at the rim or from 3. And I love that. He's actually like a pretty solid finisher through contact and even down low at the rim. He can be that lob threat. You saw him getting lobs and playing in the pick and roll with Elfrid Payton. That if he has a point guard, a DeJounte Murray, maybe a Chris Paul, as we talked about yesterday, or even an Elfrid Payton, like it really unlocks his game in a pretty significant way. He only missed 1 shot attempt that wasn't a 3. So if you take out the 2 3-point attempts, he was 8 for 9 in this game. That being that lob threat, elite finisher like that, elite, you're going against nobody. This was like a game where like who played is probably what you were saying with it. But showing that he can be kind of a multi-dimensional big, the rebounding is going to be a little bit off for him, but he's someone who can finish pretty well around the rim, be an above the rim finisher, so a vertical spacing threat, but also give you some defense with a serious block that led to an Antonio Reeves 3 on the outlet pass from that. All of that's pretty great to see from him. He should be, both these guys should, in my opinion, should be in the rotation next year for the New Orleans Pelicans because they're cheap. They're going to be able to kind of give you what you need. You still want maybe a better upgraded center. Messi scored 9 points, 5 boards in this one. It was fine. But you at least have some pieces that give you the depth that you are going to look for and still have room to grow and kind of reach their ceilings. Shout out to Jamal Cain, too. 15 points on 7 of 8 shooting. He looked really good in this one. Not a ton of defense being played by the Brooklyn Nets out here. Keon Brooks Jr. also 4 of 6 from the field, 14 points. The young guys playing well, just getting some good reps, good developmental minutes. We're really looking, though, at Antonio Reeves, at Karlo Matkovic. Jose plays hard whenever he's out there on the court. 16 points for him, 3 of 7 from 3. Getting him this run's been nice to see. Reminds you of how impactful he is as a player. But it was the New Orleans bench that really got it done against the pretty dreadful bench, frankly, from the Brooklyn Nets. You probably don't know any of the names on there. But hey, at least the Pelicans did end up losing, and I do think that is something that is rather important for this team, is basically like one more loss should solidify them in the 4th spot, and that would be great. All right, we'll have more to come in tomorrow's episode of Locked On Pelicans, more draft coverage, a couple other players I want to look at as well here. So I appreciate you all listening. Don't forget, subscribe to the Locked On Pelicans daily newsletter over at lockedondaily.com. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. This is the Locked On Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. See y'all tomorrow.